The cameras were rolling, the room was silent, and then King Charles stood up, his voice steady yet charged with something no one expected: defiance. Facing Benjamin Netanyahu across the polished oak table, he declared, "If we forget our humanity, then no victory, no war, no political gain will ever save us." For a split second, even Netanyahu's unshakable expression faltered. This was the King of England, measured, refined, but in that moment, unmistakably furious. And this was the clash that would set the tone for everything that followed. But how did a monarch trained for diplomacy end up raising his voice against one of the most powerful men in the Middle East? That's the story we need to untangle. And trust me, what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about Charles, about Netanyahu, and about the limits of leadership. The tension exploded within the first minutes of their private summit. Netanyahu leaned forward, accusing Charles of being naive, of treating politics as a stage for moral lectures instead of hard power. "You speak of compassion," Netanyahu said, "but compassion doesn't secure borders. Compassion doesn't stop rockets." His words cut like steel. Charles didn't flinch. He turned his gaze directly at Netanyahu, his tone deliberate. "But cruelty corrodes nations from the inside. A kingdom built on fear collapses long before an army crosses its gates." The room held its breath. Advisors shifted uncomfortably. No one had expected Charles to push back so directly, so fiercely. It was a side of the king the public rarely sees: human, passionate, unwilling to let go of principles even in the face of political fire. And just when it seemed Netanyahu might explode, something remarkable happened. He went silent, staring at Charles with an intensity that felt like a storm brewing behind his eyes. The moment was electric. Everyone sensed it. Something irreversible had just begun. But to understand why this clash mattered so much, we need to rewind. Because Charles wasn't just speaking as a monarch, he was speaking from decades of scars, of waiting, of learning patience and pain. He was speaking as a man who knew what it meant to endure. The lonely child at Gordonstown, bullied and misunderstood. The husband trapped in a marriage that crumbled under the world's gaze. The father forced to watch his sons torn apart by the loss of their mother. These wounds shaped him, and in that moment, they gave him strength. And yet, this was not just history repeating itself. It was something far more dangerous. Netanyahu saw Charles not as a grieving man, but as a threat. A monarch using his platform to challenge hard-nosed geopolitics with the language of humanity. That was unacceptable. Netanyahu's lips curled into a tight smile, a signal of battle disguised as courtesy. "Your words might impress the people," he said coldly, "but they do not move the real players of this world. Do you truly believe kindness can bend steel?" Charles leaned forward. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. But cruelty breaks it." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the first true collision of their worlds, and neither man was willing to step back. One stood for calculated force, the other for enduring humanity. And this was only the beginning. Because what came next would not only test their resolve, it would expose a truth neither man was ready for. A truth that would shake even the strongest believer in power politics. And yes, what you're about to see will change how you look at Charles forever. Stay right here, because in just a moment, the next revelation will turn this entire confrontation upside down. The clash in that grand chamber wasn't born in a vacuum. To grasp its weight, we must rewind decades. Back to the boy who would one day become king, but who began as a child struggling to belong. At Gordonstown School in Scotland, Charles was mocked for his sensitivity, bullied for his quiet nature, and often left isolated. Where others hardened into cynics, he learned something else: the resilience of empathy. He grew up not as the fearless warrior his father wanted, but as a thinker who believed that kindness, though fragile, could endure storms longer than cruelty ever could. That belief would become the foundation of the man who now sat across from Benjamin Netanyahu. This difference, this stark opposition, was exactly why sparks flew. Netanyahu, molded by years of war politics and the weight of national survival, had come to see morality as a luxury, a shield too thin to block real bullets. To him, Charles's words weren't just impractical, they were dangerous. And as the king spoke of humanity, Netanyahu's jaw tightened. He had fought on battlefields. He had buried friends. To him, compassion sounded like weakness, and weakness meant death. But Charles's strength lay in precisely what Netanyahu dismissed. He was not hardened steel. He was tempered glass, fragile at first glance, but resilient in ways no one anticipated. And as he pressed Netanyahu with words about the erosion of nations from within, he was channeling decades of lessons learned in silence. Yet there was another layer, one the public rarely saw. Charles had spent his life waiting. Waiting behind Elizabeth's throne, waiting for approval, waiting to finally step into his role. For 70 years, patience defined him. That endless waiting forged in him a vision of leadership Netanyahu couldn't understand. The kind that doesn't rush to dominate but endures until the right moment arrives. That patience, now sharpened into conviction, was what Netanyahu faced across that table. And just when the atmosphere threatened to suffocate everyone in the room, Charles dropped a phrase that shifted the entire dynamic. He spoke not of politics or power, but of humanity's shared future. If leaders cannot dream of peace, he said, his voice calm but unyielding, then we condemn our children to inherit only ashes. The room froze. Advisors who had dismissed Charles as symbolic now realized they were watching a man who believed every word he said. And Netanyahu? For the briefest second, his eyes flickered with something that looked like doubt. He quickly masked it, but it was there, a crack in the armor of certainty. But here's the twist. That doubt wasn't weakness. It was the prelude to something even more explosive. Because Netanyahu, far from backing down, was preparing a counterstrike. Not with weapons, but with words sharp enough to wound Charles where he was most vulnerable. And he knew exactly where to aim. Before that blow landed, let me say this. If you're still here, don't just watch. Subscribe now, hit that button, and stay with us. More is coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Do it now, because what's about to unfold is unlike anything you've ever heard in a royal confrontation. Netanyahu leaned in, lowering his voice so only Charles and a handful of advisors could hear. "You speak of children," he said, "but what of your own? A family fractured, a monarchy doubted. If compassion were strength, wouldn't your house be unshakable?" The words hit like a blade to the chest. Charles stiffened. The reference to his sons, to the shadow of Diana, was a strike below the belt. Gasps rippled through the room, and just when it seemed Charles might falter, he did something extraordinary. He straightened his shoulders, his eyes burning with something fiercer than anger, resolve. "My family," he replied, "has suffered, yes. But from suffering we learn, and I will never let grief teach me cruelty." It was more than a retort. It was a declaration. And it marked the second great turning point of this confrontation. But make no mistake, what Netanyahu was about to unleash next would be darker, sharper, and far more personal than anyone in that room could anticipate. Because this was no longer just politics. This was war of the spirit. And the next move would leave scars no camera could erase. The sting of Netanyahu's words still lingered in the air. He had gone for the one place Charles was most vulnerable, his family, and yet the king refused to collapse under the weight of the attack. Instead, his resolve seemed to harden, as though every insult, every doubt, every shadow of Diana's tragic memory was being transformed into fuel. But Netanyahu wasn't done. He pressed forward, his tone colder now, surgical in its precision. You think grief gives you wisdom? Number grief makes leaders hesitate, and hesitation is fatal. That is why your speeches may inspire, but they cannot command. The room vibrated with tension. Every advisor knew what Netanyahu was doing, dismantling Charles not as a king, but as a man. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed to work. Charles's eyes flickered downward, his breath caught in his chest. Was this the breaking point? Had the king, after a lifetime of waiting, finally met a challenge too heavy to bear? But then, something remarkable happened. He lifted his head, and the vulnerability on his face didn't vanish. It transformed. Instead of hiding his scars, Charles embraced them. You mistake grief for weakness, he said quietly, but weakness is the denial of pain. To accept pain and still choose compassion. That is strength. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. It was not the voice of a monarch cloaked in pomp, but of a man who had lived through storms and still chosen light. And that was precisely what made Netanyahu uneasy. Because while power can intimidate, resilience born from suffering carries a force harder to dismantle. But the Israeli leader wasn't about to let the king seize the moment. He struck again, this time aiming not at Charles's family, but at his vision for the world. You speak of peace as though it were inevitable, Netanyahu scoffed, but history proves otherwise. Peace is not given, it is taken, seized, forced into existence. Do you really think poetry can stop blood from flowing? Charles didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes locked, and answered with fire. Peace is not taken, it is built, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. And if leaders refuse to build it, then our children will inherit ruins instead of hope. His words, once again, did not sound like rhetoric, they sounded like a man's final vow. The silence that followed was unbearable until Netanyahu slammed his hand on the table. Advisors flinched. Some even whispered, fearing the discussion had crossed into something irreversible, and in truth, it had. Because here came the next turning point. The storm no one had seen coming. Netanyahu shifted, his voice dark and almost triumphant. You speak of children and hope, but let me remind you, the world doesn't see you as a builder. They see you as a relic, an aging monarch clinging to ideals while power slips through your fingers. You are not the future, Charles. You are the past. The words landed like bombs. For a second, the king's face stiffened, his jaw clenched. He was being written off, dismissed not just as a leader, but as irrelevant. It was the deepest cut yet, and everyone in the room felt it. And yet, rather than recoil, Charles did something unexpected. He smiled, not in mockery, but in quiet defiance. The past, he said slowly, is where cruelty belongs. The future belongs to compassion. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Even those who had doubted him now leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing history in motion. But this wasn't the end. No, the confrontation had reached only its third act. And just when the air seemed to settle, Netanyahu prepared his deadliest strike yet. One that would drag secrets into the light, one that would force Charles to face not just his past, but the very essence of what it meant to be king. Before we reveal that final twist, stop hesitating, subscribe right now, and keep watching. This story is spiraling toward its most shocking moment, and you need to see how it ends. Take action now, because the biggest revelation is seconds away. What Netanyahu was about to say would not only rattle Charles, it would rattle the very idea of monarchy itself. And once those words left his lips, nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. Netanyahu leaned back, eyes narrowing like a predator calculating his final strike. He had tested Charles's patience, attacked his family, mocked his vision. But now he prepared to drop the heaviest blow of all, a truth twisted into a weapon. "You talk about compassion as if it were eternal," he said, his voice carrying a sinister calm. "But compassion cannot erase hypocrisy. The world remembers Diana. The world remembers your silence when your family tore itself apart. And they wonder, how can a man who failed his own house dare to preach about healing nations?" The room erupted in whispers. Advisors glanced nervously at Charles, some expecting him to wither under the weight of the accusation. This was not strategy anymore. This was Netanyahu digging into the deepest scar of the king's life. And for a heartbeat, it seemed Charles might collapse beneath it. His eyes darkened, his hands tightened on the armrest, but then he rose. Not just from his chair, but above the shadow caused by decades of doubt. His voice carried not the tone of defense, but of revelation. "Yes," he said firmly, "I have known failure. I have known grief. I have known shame. But do you know what those wounds taught me? That every human being is fragile. That power means nothing if it does not protect the fragile. My compassion was not born from perfection. It was born from imperfection." The words struck harder than any retort could have. Netanyahu shifted in his seat, his expression faltering for the first time. The man who thrived on control now faced a king who had stripped himself bare and turned vulnerability into strength, and the entire chamber felt the shift. Charles had stopped fighting on Netanyahu's terms and forced the confrontation onto his own ground. But the king wasn't finished. His voice rose, resonant and unshakable. "Leadership is not measured by how many enemies you crush. It is measured by how many lives you refuse to sacrifice. And if you believe that cruelty will save your people, you are wrong. Cruelty does not save, it devours." The silence that followed was thunderous. Netanyahu's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. For the first time, his arsenal of rhetoric had met something it could not pierce. Truth delivered with absolute conviction. And then came the moment no one expected. Charles turned not just to Netanyahu, but to the entire room, advisors, staff, cameras. His words no longer belonged to a private clash. They were meant for the world. "If compassion is weakness," he declared, "then I choose weakness. Because weakness that builds hope is stronger than cruelty that breeds despair." Gasps echoed. Some stared in awe, others in disbelief. But everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic. The King of England had transformed the battlefield, using nothing but humanity as his weapon. This was the final turning point. The clash was not about who won the argument. It was about which vision of the future would outlive the other. Netanyahu represented steel, unbending and sharp, but destined to rust. Charles embodied endurance, fragile at first sight, but impossible to shatter. Before we close, take action now. Subscribe and stay with us. Because moments like this, when history bends before our very eyes, are what this channel is all about. Don't just watch. Be part of it. Netanyahu sat in silence, his face a storm of restrained fury. He had not been defeated by politics, nor by diplomacy, but by something more dangerous. The power of a man who refused to abandon his humanity. And Charles, standing tall despite every scar, proved that even in the cruelest battles, compassion can still triumph. The cameras captured the final frame. Charles's eyes unwavering, Netanyahu's fists clenched on the table. No words were spoken, no truce was declared. But the image said it all. Cruelty had met its challenger, and compassion had not bowed. And as the footage spread, millions would debate who won. But deep down, one truth would remain undeniable. King Charles had revealed not just the weight of a crown, but the heart of a man. And that revelation would echo far longer than any argument.